bit of a change of pace and head into the field. Resistance management's not going to be one of the sexiest topics that you hear about in the next couple of days, but it's a very important part of crop production, particularly in light of the fact that crop protection chemistry will be the cornerstone of producing consistent quality fruit and veggies for the foreseeable future. And also when you consider the fact that there's a lot of investment of time and money, obviously, in bringing products from inception through to the marketplace. Today I'd just like to give you a bit of a brief overview of horticulture in the dry tropics, then move into the challenges for managing resistance and how we're going about trying to address those challenges in the foreseeable future. I'm based in Bowen, which is about 1,200 kilometres north of here, in a region known as the dry tropics, on the coast halfway between Mackay and Townsville. The dry tropics, we have summer dominant rainfall, and our winter period is mild and dry, which is ideal for growing vegetable crops. In Bowen and the Gumlu region, which is 60 kilometres north, and then further up into the Burdekin, which is about 100 kilometres north of Bowen, basically vegetables including tomatoes, capsicums, eggplant, sweet corn, beans, and a wide range of cucurbits. Production out of this region is worth about $450 million per year, so it's a major winter horticultural production area. We start planting late February, early March at the end of the wet season, and we basically sequentially plant right through until about early September, and our harvest period basically starts in May and continues through till the end of November. We then have the summer months, so December, January, February off during the wet season, so there's a production break there. In terms of the major insect pests, chewing pests are still number one. Heliothis, which is a pest in a lot of regions, cluster caterpillar and cucumber moth. A major pest that first surfaced in the late 90s in Bowen was the silverleaf whitefly, and in recent years it's now become a vector of a major virus called tomato yellow leaf curl virus. Tomato thrips are another major sucking pest, and they're also a vector of a very debilitating virus called tomato spotted wilt virus. In addition to those, in recent years we've seen a shift from the use of broad spectrum chemistry to more selective safe chemistry, and that's seen the emergence of some of our sucking bugs like green vegetable bug, grey cluster bug and green mirrored. So now we're seeing a bit of a shift in the combination of pests in our crops. Similarly, with foliar diseases, powdery mildew is the number one foliar disease in our area in both cucurbits and fruiting vegetables like tomatoes and capsicums. Cucurbits also have issues with downy mildew and gummy stem blight, and tomatoes with grey leaf spot. And in wet years, the bacterial diseases, particularly bacterial spot, is a major issue in both tomatoes and capsicums. Just to give you a bit of an overview of the Bowen region, it's quite a compact production area. It's basically 25 kilometres in length and 10 kilometres across. And within that zone, we're probably producing between 5,000 and 6,000 hectares of vegetables. I've calculated there's about 38 growers in our area, and only 12 of those have actually engaged professional consultants to monitor their crops. And I've just plotted where that production occurs within our zone. That accounts for about 55% of our total production. So the other 26 growers, give or take a few, produces 45%, and that's the location of where those growers are. So you can see that even though there's a fair percentage in terms of area, there's a lot of production areas within the Bowen area where there's no one professionally monitoring crops and providing advice to growers. Our prevailing winds come from those two directions, mainly southeasterly, but through to northeasterly. So again, if you're thinking about mobile pests that get carried on the wind, That's a big issue, and you can see the potential for influence between farms. They're all in amongst each other. So that just gives you a bit of a better picture of how it all stacks up. It's quite complex, and as I said, when you overlay the fact that we're sequentially planting for 6 months of the year, it makes it very difficult in the context of managing pests, and then particularly crop protection resistance to manage that. About 12 months ago, almost to the day, the DuPont crop protection team initiated a meeting in Bowen. It was initially targeting the group 28 insecticides, the diamides, and the motivation for that was that their latest product in that group, Benevia, had just hit the market, and there was concern about how we would go about managing resistance, not only in our area but elsewhere where those diamides are used, and trying to come up with some tactics that could be implemented locally. The first in those groups was Kuragin, so that's a DuPont product, and Belt soon after from Bayer. And both of those, as you can see, are targeting or registered for the use against chewing pests. Even in the early stages of these products hitting the market, there was some confusion, and growers didn't really realise that they were both in the same group. Just to complicate matters, along came Gerevo, which is a soil-applied product containing both a Group 28 and a Group 4A. And importantly, it was not only just targeting chewing pests, but the 4A component was also targeting sucking pests. And that product gets applied at planting, at transplanting. And then Benevia as well, again a foliar product, but also with registrations against both chewing and sucking pests. So even just within that one group, there was a need to try and ensure that growers and people making recommendations to growers realised that all of those products were all Group 28s, and we had to come up with some way of making sure that we manage resistance to a new and very important chemical group. The traditional wisdom is to use window strategies, which might be fine if you're in a cotton production area where sowing happens, almost synchronously. The basic principle is to avoid exposing consecutive pest generations to insecticides of the same mode of action. So basically, you're using treatment windows of roughly the same duration as the pest generation, and one or more modes of action could be used in that period. Importantly, you then don't apply the same mode of action in the following window. That sounds great in theory, but I'm just going to take you through a couple of pests that are very topical at the moment, just to illustrate some of the issues that we face. Silverleaf whitefly, major pest throughout the world, has a high risk of developing resistance. And as you can see in those photos there, we get some massive populations up our way. This here is a photograph looking down a microscope. That's 1 square centimetre of leaf. All those little brown and yellow dots you can see there are eggs and small nymphs for the silverleaf whitefly. We stopped counting at 400 eggs on that square centimetre, and there's about 50 small nymphs. So that is a massive population, and early this year a lot of the chemistry that's being used against silverleaf whitefly is being put up against that sort of population. So the opportunities for resistance development in a pest that's known to be high risk is immense. Just quickly, when I first started consulting in Bowen and silverleaf whitefly first showed up, we basically only had the old broad spectrums to control that pest, and before too long they developed resistance. We're now in a situation where we have a greater range of groups to work with. All of them are generally very effective chemistry. The challenge now is to not waste the fact that we now have far more options to use, and we have to develop ways in which we can use that chemistry and extend the life of that chemistry in our area for as long as possible. Similarly, powdery mildew in cucurbits was also a major problem and is known to be high risk for developing resistance to fungicides. Again, 20 years ago, we had very few options. It got to the point where powdery mildew was almost out of control. there's been a lot of, then we had a few start to pop up, but now there's been a considerable amount of development of new chemistry in the last 20 years. And again, we've got a great range of groups, actives from a range of groups that we can use. So there's no reason why we can't develop some solid and sustainable resistance management strategies with that chemistry. There's even a couple more that will come through in the next couple of years. So again, it's our responsibility of stewards of this chemistry to make sure that we're utilising that as well as we can. I won't run through all this, but what we basically started to do is growers have a lot on their plate these days, and it's very hard for them to sit down and digest all of this information. They're bombarded with information from all sources. For those that don't have consultants working for them and concentrating on this sort of activity on their behalf, there's no way that I think that a grower can do that on their own. So we're starting to put together some guidelines, which is just a summary of what's already out there, putting it in a simple form so that we can pass it on to growers, and hopefully they can start to think more about how they apply this chemistry. In terms of the challenges that we face, I've already touched on the first one, that it's a long season of sequential plantings, basically going for 10 months of the year. We've got a wide range of crops which host the main insect pests. So something like silverleaf whitefly is basically a pest on every crop that we grow except sweet corn. And also importantly, there's multiple pests in each of those crops. So we're not just trying to control silverleaf whitefly. There's other chewing pests, there's other sucking pests, and there's also sucking bugs that are now starting to create an issue. So when I walk into a crop, checking the crop's the easy part. It's trying to come up with a recommendation that not only controls all of the pests that the grower has got in his crop, it's also taking into account that we need to manage the chemistry that we've got at our disposal. Another big issue is that product registrations are not consistent across all the crops that we grow. So that list of chemicals for the silverleaf whitefly control, some of them are only registered on a couple of those and not other crops. So again, that becomes an issue if you start talking about window strategies, because some of these crops don't have access to all of those product registrations. Another issue that I think is something that we can work on both where we are and I think generally is the communication within the local industry. Again, growers are very busy, their time is at a premium, and I don't think there's enough communication between growers. And I know even as consultants, we're flat out just trying to run our businesses. There's not a lot of time for communicating with other consultants or growers. And so I think we can try and look at ways that we can improve the communication within our local industry, and probably between industries as well. I think there's a lot we can learn from other places where resistance management strategies have been implemented successfully. So the question that was coming out of the meeting that DuPont initially convened was, yes, we've got a complex problem to deal with. How do we go about implementing or developing and then implementing effective resistance management strategies? What we decided to do was to set up a working group, which is chaired by the local industry development officer with the Bowen Gumlu Growers Association, Anna McGowan, and myself and a consultant from the Burdekin. So we've formed a working party which is aiming to try and address some of these issues, starting initially with just some workshops to try and get information out to both growers and other people involved in crop production in our area. The other thing that we've done is we've started to put together what we've called the resistance management puzzle. And it's only a starting point, and it'll probably change over time, but we identified 9 areas that we needed to start to focus on, not just focusing solely on the chemistry, but other things as well, to try and address resistance management. So I'll start up the top left. I think, as I touched on before, the most important thing, particularly for growers who are not getting professional advice, is to get the information out to them so that they fully understand what these chemicals do, the modes of action. It's a lot more complex now than it was 20 years ago when you just had broad spectrum knockdown chemistry. And growers are growers. It's our job as consultants to provide the information that they need to help them make decisions about how they manage their pests. So we need to understand those chemicals and we need to pass that information on to those that need it. Obviously, the next step is to develop a resistance management strategy, and it's been our intention not to just produce something that looks nice on a piece of A4 paper. It's got to be something that's practical, can be implemented, and hopefully that the whole industry buys into. Importantly, we wanted to make sure that the whole focus wasn't just on the chemistry side of things, that there's other factors that can be used to help manage resistance. And that, I believe, is the most important factor in this whole process. Something as simple as a production break that I alluded to before. For 3 months of the year, we don't have crop in the ground. So that's an opportunity to have a time where the life cycle of some of these pests can be broken, to let the natural enemies that occur out in the scrub around our production areas to suppress these populations before we start back planting in the next season. We had a situation this year where we've had a very dry wet season. There was crops going into the ground in mid-January, and all that's done is it's picked up large populations that were still ticking over from the end of our previous season. All of a sudden we've got them in crop, the start of our season, and a massive problem has developed. So they're the sort of issues. It's purely voluntary, but people need to be aware of the importance of a production break. Then we move into things like farm planning. Again, something simple like when you plant into the prevailing wind so that you're not having the situation where the prevailing wind is pushing pests from old crops into new crops. Where possible, try and use geography to move your production away from areas where there might be problems being experienced. That's not always possible, but again, it's got to be something that's considered when you're talking about planning for your season. Down the bottom right, very importantly, and it's one that's close to my heart, is monitoring. I think that we need to be very conscious of making sure that decisions about spraying this chemistry is based on monitoring, on solid numbers, and targeting that chemistry against insects that are at certain thresholds. We've seen situations where, calendar spraying amazingly still occurs, and that's a real issue in our area, and I'm sure it's still an issue in other areas as well. The other side of monitoring, and again, it's something that I believe is very important in this process, we need to be monitoring the resistance levels of the various chemistries in our pests. We've got very little baseline data for any of the chemistry that's available, and the question's always going to be who pays for it, but I can't see the point in having a resistance management strategy in place if you can't measure what you're supposed to manage. So I think we need to come up with some sort of model where we can use some funding to monitor the resistance levels over time, and it gives us a way of evaluating how effective our strategy is and also identifying ways in which we can make it better. Beneficial insects, natural enemies, whatever you want to call them. One of the exciting things about crop protection at the moment is we have this safe, selective, new generation chemistry available which is targeting our pests but not having a major impact on a lot of our beneficial insects. And what better way to mop up any resistant individuals that might pop up in the course of a crop but to have these guys floating around, guys and girls, floating around in the crop, taking out anything that might have got through our sprays. In Bowen, against silverleaf whitefly, we have released an exotic parasitic wasp called Eretmosceras hayati, and it's doing a fantastic job. We're even considering now the possibility of releasing that insect, which is reared in a production facility, out into the surrounding areas at the end of our season so that it can get established and help to manage the pests during our production break. Other things like trichogramma and then all the usual natural enemies that build up that we never knew existed when we were using broad spectrums. Now we're starting to get an understanding of the role that these guys can play, particularly in managing resistance. A broad one is cultural practices. I won't go into this too much, but again, with silverleaf whitefly being a mobile pest, one of the biggest problems we have is when a crop is finished and the grower's going to clean up, they'll run a slasher through the crop. And all that does is it pushes all the insects that can fly out of that crop, either into their own young plantings or their neighbours. We have a saying in Bowen that you're only as clean as your dirtiest neighbour. So those sort of cultural practices are quite simple. It's just a matter of being aware of the importance of adopting those practices, which minimises the chance of those individuals moving from crop to crop. We have about 8 to 9 generations of whitefly in a year. So the last thing we want to do is let one generation keep just rolling through and carrying all those resistance genes right through the season. Communication, I touched on that before. Again, it's the key with any of these. I think we have to start looking at using some of the new technology like smartphones or YouTube videos and find out the ways in which we can get the information to those that need it. It's not much point having this information looking pretty on a piece of paper or an iPad or something. It needs to get to those who need it and give them the opportunity to digest it and ask questions. And it's going to be different for different people. Growers that I know, a lot of them don't like sitting in a room watching PowerPoint slides. So a lot of what I do is one-on-one. Sometimes you just need to go to that level, and we need to identify the ways in which people want to consume this information to help them make better decisions. And finally, the missing link is area-wide management. There's nothing new there, but this is not going to work unless it's adopted on an area-wide basis. There's been plenty of examples, and the cotton industry is a good one, and other horticultural production areas where resistance management strategies have been implemented on an area-wide basis, and it's done a fantastic job, great outcomes. But you've got to have everyone on board. It's a voluntary thing, so you need to have people buy in. So our challenge is to try and get all this puzzle in place and get people to buy in. We do have a precedent. Just briefly touch on this. In the late 80s and early 90s in Bowen, the potato tube moth or tomato leaf miner almost totally destroyed the tomato industry in Bowen. This chart here is, we had a network of traps through the district, and it was male pheromone traps, and each week we'd count the number of male moths in those traps. Each of those peaks coincided with basically the start of spring, when we used to get the traditional lift as the weather warmed. And you can see that in 1993, extreme numbers, so that's 350 male moths per trap per week. It probably doesn't mean a lot, but that when you have to count them, that's a lot, and it had a devastating impact on the industry. You can see each year, in the next 5 years, the decline in those trap counts. And the reason for that was not new chemistry. It was solely that the growers and the people involved in the industry adopted an area-wide strategy, mainly using cultural controls to help manage the movement of those moths within the district. So each year, things like cleaning up crops quickly, making sure there was a production break, all those sorts of things were implemented across the district. And over time, purely by following that sort of process, we've got to the point now where leaf miner is non-existent. So in 5 years, we got from a catastrophe to back on track. So that's something that, in a recent talk I gave, I just reminded the growers that we've done it before. We don't want to have to get to a crisis point before we act. So all of these things that we can do now, we need to start putting it in a package that they're willing to pick up and run with. So that's a bit of a North Queensland perspective on managing insecticide resistance. Thanks very much for your time, and I'm happy to take any questions.